They say the forest is quiet, but that's a lie. The forest breathes, it listens, and when it doesn't like what it hears, it lets you know. Trees don't just grow in rows and rings. They guard memories, secrets, and sometimes something worse. In these woods, you won't always see what's stalking you. You'll feel it first. A whisper, a flicker of motion. Tools moved, eyes watching. Some monsters howl, others simply wait. These are 5 true stories from the logging world, where men with saws and grit met things they couldn't cut down, and some of them never came back. Story 1. The Hidebehind. You can call me Jacob. I've been a logger most of my adult life, and I've seen my fair share of strange things out in the woods. Things you could brush off as coincidence or imagination after a long shift and not enough sleep. But what happened that winter in northern British Columbia still sticks with me like bark under your nails. I was part of a 4-man crew working a remote contract about 3 hours from the nearest real town. No cell service, no quick exits, just miles of snow-laced pine and hard labor ahead of us. There was Mitch, a big guy from Vancouver who'd been in the industry almost as long as I had. He didn't believe in anything supernatural, thought it was all crap meant for kids and ghost hunters. Then there was Luis, our greenhorn. This was his first big job, eager to prove himself but still learning the ropes. And finally, old man Riley. He must have had 30 years under his belt. The kind of logger who knew more superstitions than he did safety protocols, and who treated them with the same level of seriousness. We drove up in 2 trucks, arriving just before sundown. The company had set up a temporary camp for us, bare-bones trailers with bunk beds, a generator that sputtered in the cold, and a portable kitchen that always smelled faintly of grease and coffee. On the way in, we stopped at a rundown diner, in the last town before the logging road turned to gravel. The kind of place that looked like it hadn't updated its wallpaper or its waitstaff since 1975. We ordered some eggs and coffee, trying to warm up before the isolation set in. That's when this local guy sitting at the counter struck up a conversation. He asked where we were headed, and when we told him, his face changed. He leaned in, voice dropping a bit, and asked if we'd ever heard of the Hidebehind. Mitch rolled his eyes immediately, muttering something under his breath. But the guy wasn't joking. He said something tall and thin had been seen lurking in those woods, something that moved just out of sight, always hiding behind the trees, watching. Luis looked confused. Riley just nodded, real slow, like he'd heard all this before, and maybe believed it. The first week went by without incident. We fell into our rhythm fast. Early mornings, long days, cold nights. Mitch worked like a machine, always moving, always muttering about how green Luis was. Luis, to his credit, took the hazing like a champ. He kept his head down and learned. Quick! Riley kept mostly to himself, speaking up only when he had something worth saying, which wasn't often. We started making progress on the contract, clearing the first stretch of land faster than expected, but little things started to feel off. At first it was just misplaced tools, small stuff. A chainsaw file vanishing, only to be found an hour later, perched perfectly upright on a stump 30 yards into a section we hadn't even touched yet. Fuel canisters nudged out of line, cables coiled in ways we hadn't left them. Everyone figured someone else had moved them, but soon it became clear that none of us had. I chalked it up to forgetfulness or exhaustion. Mitch blamed Luis. Luis looked scared but said nothing. Riley began muttering to himself more often. Every morning before we started, he would walk the perimeter of our work area, whispering under his breath and leaving tiny scraps of food or shiny objects on the edge of the clearing. His way of paying respect, he said. Mitch laughed at him at first. That didn't last long. By the second week, the air in the woods began to feel heavier, like something was watching us. I caught myself glancing over my shoulder far too often, only to see nothing but trees and snow. More than once I saw movement at the edge of my vision, a flicker of shadow slipping behind a tree just as I turned my head. Luis admitted to feeling the same, said he started wearing a medallion his grandmother had blessed for protection. Mitch scoffed at that, but even he stopped working alone. No one said it, but all of us began grouping up without planning to. Something unspoken passed between us, an understanding that whatever was out there, it didn't feel right. Then came the marks, long vertical grooves, deep in the bark of trees we hadn't touched yet, always in sets of 4 or 5 sometimes, 5 feet off the ground, like something tall had dragged claws across them. They didn't look like bare scratches. We all agreed on that, too clean, too deliberate. Mitch tried to pass it off as someone playing a prank or maybe an animal we hadn't seen before. But none of us bought it. Next came the sounds. Whispering. Not voices exactly, but just at the edge of hearing. Like overhearing a conversation from another room, but being unable to make out the words. Sometimes it seemed to follow us, flitting from one tree to the next, always staying out of sight. We'd stop and listen, trying to pin it down, but the moment you focused on it, it disappeared. At one point, Luis swore he heard someone humming an old lullaby, but when he turned to check, no one was there. Things escalated from there. One morning, we found every single chainsaw in our camp, 7 of them, sitting in a neat pile in the middle of the workyard. The trailer had been locked all night, and there were no signs of a break-in. The locks weren't broken, not even tampered with. But the saws were outside, arranged like some kind of offering or threat. We stood around them in silence, each of us waiting for someone else to explain it. No one could. Luis was the next to be touched by it, literally. He was flagging trees one afternoon when he suddenly screamed and came running back toward the clearing, pale and shaking. He swore something had grabbed his shoulder. When we pulled his coat down, we saw the bruises, 4 long finger-like marks, dark and swelling, like something massive had clutched him and let go. Mitch went quiet after that. He still refused to admit anything was wrong, but he never went out of sight again, not even to piss. And then the worst thing yet. We came in early one morning and found it. A freshly severed elk head mounted on a pole, planted just outside the entrance to our site. It wasn't a hunter's trophy. This thing had been torn off, not cut. Jagged bone, ripped muscle, fur still, matted with blood. And the head, God, the head had been positioned just so, facing the camp directly. Like it was watching us, like it was warning us. Riley didn't say a word. He just knelt down and started whispering again, shaking slightly. Mitch didn't even crack a joke. None of us did. That day, we didn't pick up our saws. We just stared at that pole for a long time, each of us quietly realizing that we might have stumbled into something we were never meant to disturb. And something didn't want us there. We didn't sleep well after the elk head. That night, the camp was deathly silent. No crickets, no wind, no distant hoot of an owl. Just the occasional creak of the trailer settling and our own nervous breathing. The wildlife officer we called took half a day to reach us, and when he finally showed up, the pole and the elk head were gone, just gone. No trace of blood, no broken ground where it had been placed, nothing. He looked skeptical, scribbled in his notepad, and mumbled something about pranksters or a rival crew. But the look in his eyes said he didn't believe it either. He found tracks around where the pole had stood, barely visible, but long and deep, bipedal, massive. The stride between them was twice the length of a man's, like something tall had walked through but left no other trace. That evening, Riley finally broke his silence. We gathered in the mess trailer, too tense to pretend this was still just another job. Riley stirred his instant coffee slowly, then told us about the old stories, the real ones. He said Hidebehinds weren't just folklore, not just stories loggers, told around campfires to scare the new guys. They were territorial spirits, old as the forest itself. They didn't kill for food, he said. They didn't want to conquer or chase. They wanted to be left alone, and when people didn't listen, they warned. Then they acted. Sometimes that meant tricks, missing tools, whispers, bruises. Sometimes it meant disappearances. Riley had seen something similar once back in the 80s on a job in Ontario. That crew hadn't listened. 3 men had vanished. One had been found wandering days later, incoherent, talking nonsense about something long and narrow that moved like smoke. The other 2 were never recovered. Riley looked straight at us and said, "This thing isn't playing anymore." That elk head was a line in the dirt. We held a crew meeting that night. The contract was good money, sure, but no one was arguing about the paycheck anymore. Luis wanted to leave immediately. Mitch didn't say anything for a long time, then nodded. "Whatever this is," he said, "it doesn't want us here." I didn't want to leave. I'd never walked away from a job in my life. But that silence, that presence, I couldn't ignore it anymore. And Riley? He just looked tired. "There's old ways to make peace," he said softly, "but they take time and respect, and maybe we're already past that point." The next morning we called the company, told them we were pulling out, said someone or something was tampering with equipment. That wasn't a lie. They weren't happy, but they didn't fight us either. We packed fast. No one talked much. I caught Riley walking to the tree line before we left, kneeling by a thick cedar, pulling out his lunch bag. He left half a sandwich and 2 cookies on a flat rock at the tree's base. "It's not for us," he said, not looking up. "It's for the road." As we rolled out in our trucks, I looked back one last time, just for a second. Behind the cedar, something moved. It was tall, too tall, thin as a fence post and dark, but not in a way that cast a shadow, like the light bent around it. It shifted around the tree without a sound, smooth and unnatural, like liquid sliding uphill. I blinked, and it was gone. But I know what I saw, and I know what saw me. We never went back. The company tried, though. Sent a new crew in the spring. Fresh faces, younger guys, probably thinking we'd exaggerated or let the cold get to our heads. They lasted 4 days. Didn't give a reason when they walked off the job, just left their gear in place and drove, out in silence. I heard later that they kept finding their equipment moved each morning, no matter how securely they'd locked it up, arranged in strange patterns, stacked, balanced. It wasn't vandalism, it was a message. After that, the company quietly wrote the area off, labeled it an environmental preservation zone to avoid questions, probably the smartest decision they ever made. Luis quit logging altogether, moved back to the city. Said he couldn't sleep, without thinking about that voice in the trees. Mitch is still out there somewhere working other sites, but I heard he carries a bundle of sage now and doesn't laugh at old legends anymore. Riley retired the next year. He still does consulting work now and then, but not for technical things. Companies bring him in to feel out new locations. They don't say it aloud, but everyone knows why they call him. As for me, I stayed in the business, but I've changed. I don't work alone anymore. I always listen to the woods, and I leave something behind at every site. Granola bar, trail mix, a coin, something small, something respectful. Maybe it's superstition. Maybe it's insurance, but I've learned something out there. Some parts of the forest don't belong to us. We think we can take whatever we want with chainsaws and contracts, but the trees remember. And sometimes they remind you. Even now, years later, when the light fades and the forest goes quiet, I still get that feeling like I'm being watched, like something's just behind me. Story 2. The Crying Forest. About 6 months after the Hidebehind incident, I picked up a new contract in northern Minnesota. The money was good, and I figured a change of scenery might help shake the unease I'd been carrying since British. Colombia. I told myself that not every forest was haunted, not every patch of trees had secrets. Besides, I needed the work. The site was a section of old growth that had finally been approved for selective cutting. It wasn't as remote as the last job, but it was still far enough out that cell service dropped off, and you could drive an hour without seeing another soul. This time I was joining a crew of locals, 4 guys, all experienced, all quiet, the kind of men who'd been in the woods long enough to respect it. Most of them didn't say much beyond what was necessary, but they worked hard and knew what they were doing. There was one thing that stood out from the start, though. On the first day, as we unloaded gear and went over the work plan, one of the guys, a lean, wiry man named Ed, pulled me aside and pointed to a patch of trees maybe a few hundred yards from the edge of our work area. He told me flat out, "We don't go in there after 4. I thought he was joking, some kind of local tradition or maybe a way to haze the out-of-towner, but he didn't smile. Neither did any of the others when I asked about it later. They just repeated the same line. That's crying time. You don't want to be there when it starts. Naturally, I asked what that meant. I didn't get an answer, just a shrug and the kind of look people give when they're too polite to call you stupid, but think you'll find out soon enough. I'd worked through fear before. I'd faced things I couldn't explain. So I nodded, said okay, and figured it was just some superstition. But I should have paid more attention to how none of them would even look in that direction. The first 2 days went smoothly enough. The crew kept to themselves, and so did I. The trees were tall and thick in that part of the state, mostly pine and spruce, tangled with undergrowth that made movement slow outside of the clear-cut lines. The men were efficient, quiet, and strangely synchronized, like they'd worked together for years and didn't need to speak much to get things done. But even in that rhythm, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was just lurking. It wasn't obvious at first, just a tension that hung in the air like humidity you can't see but feel in your bones. On the 3rd day, I found out why I'd been behind schedule because of some equipment trouble. My GPS unit kept cutting out, and the replacement they'd given me needed recalibration. So I worked late, pushing deeper into the grid to catch up before sunset. The rest of the crew had already packed it in. I was alone. The light was fading, not fast, but steadily, the sky turning pale blue as the treetops swayed in a breeze I hadn't noticed earlier. That's when I heard it. A sound I couldn't place at first, faint and soft like water running through gravel. Then it grew clearer, more human. Someone was crying. At first, I thought it might be a prank, a local kid trying to mess with the crew. But the voice didn't sound like a joke. It was raw and aching, young, feminine, and completely heartbroken. She wasn't screaming or wailing, just sobbing like someone lost in the deepest kind of grief. The sound seemed to float through the trees, never coming from the same direction twice. I tried to follow it, but every time I thought I was close, it would shift behind me, then ahead, then off to the side. My skin prickled. Something in my gut twisted, telling me to stop, to leave, but I kept moving toward it, curiosity overriding, caution. I finally pulled myself out when I remembered what Ed had said. Crying time. I checked my watch. It was nearly 4:30. The sun had dropped low enough to cast long shadows across the underbrush. I turned around and made my way back to the trucks without looking behind me. The next morning, I asked about it. None of them were surprised. They didn't even try to play dumb. Ed just sighed and pointed to that patch of woods again. "It's her," he said quietly. "She's still looking." They told me the story in fragments over the next couple days, as if none of them wanted to say too much at once. Back in the 1920s, there had been a small camp out there, a winter operation during a particularly harsh year. One of the loggers had a daughter, 16 or 17, who would bring lunch to the men every day. One afternoon she got caught in a sudden storm, whiteout conditions. They searched for weeks but never found her. No body, no footprints, just one of her mittens hanging from a low branch days later. Some said the girl never left, that every winter as the light began to fade, she would return, crying, wandering, asking one simple question: "Are you going home?" No one knew what happened if you answered. Some said you'd vanish. Others claimed you'd get turned around and wander until exposure took you. All the crew agreed on one rule: if you heard the voice, you didn't respond. Not a word. You left, as calmly as you could, and you didn't look back. By the 5th day, the unease had turned into dread. We found footprints, bare, small, delicate, just outside the equipment trailer in the morning. They weren't there the night before. They started at the edge of the clearing and moved directly to where each of us had worked the day before, stopping at the flagged trees. Then they disappeared, no trail leading out. The soil was damp from a light overnight drizzle, making the prints crisp and clear. The strangest part? They overlapped our own boot prints, as if someone or something had walked through during the storm, leaving no sign of entry, only exit. That afternoon, I heard the crying again. This time it sounded closer. Not distant and floating, but deliberate. Focused, like it was following me. It was late in the afternoon when it happened, close to 3:30, though the light was already fading in that grey, washed-out way it does before snow. I was finishing up a section near the tree line, working faster than usual, trying to shake off the growing anxiety that had been tightening around my chest all day. I hadn't heard anything for hours, not the birds, not the wind, not even the crunch of my own boots over dead needles. The whole forest felt like it had gone still, holding its breath. That's when I heard it again, the crying, but this time it wasn't drifting through the woods or echoing off trunks. It was close, so close that I could hear the tremble in her breath, the wet, broken cadence of each sob. It sounded like she was standing just behind one of the trees a few feet away, half hidden behind the brush. Every hair on my body stood on end. I couldn't bring myself to move. My hands were gripping my marker flag so tightly that my knuckles had gone pale beneath my gloves. I turned slowly, scanning the trees, and that's when I heard it. Not sobbing, but a voice. A young female voice, clear, gentle, almost hopeful. "Are you going home?" It wasn't whispered like some horror movie cliché. It wasn't sinister. It was soft and sad, like a lost child who just wanted to know if someone could show her the way. "And God help me," I almost answered. The instinct to comfort her, to offer help, surged in my chest like a reflex. It felt wrong to ignore her. But somewhere deep in my mind, buried beneath every rational thought, I remembered what Ed and the others had told me. Don't answer. I swallowed hard, my mouth suddenly dry, and turned slowly toward the sound without making a noise. There was no one there, just a narrow space between two trees, shadowed and silent. Then I felt the air shift. It was like the forest exhaled, cold, damp, and heavy against my skin. I backed away one step at a time until I could see the trail back to the equipment lot. The voice didn't follow me, but I could feel something watching, just past my peripheral vision. I didn't look back, I didn't speak. I walked slowly, calmly, gripping my gear until my fingers ached. When I reached the truck, Ed was already sitting in the cab. He looked at me once, saw my face, and nodded. Neither of us said a word the whole way back. That night I told the crew I had a family emergency back home. It wasn't true, but no one questioned it. I packed my things, handed off my remaining duties, and left before dawn the next morning. The bonus I would have earned for staying through the end of the job evaporated, but I didn't care. As I drove down that long gravel road away from the site, I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone or something walking down the center of the trail, bare feet brushing the frost-covered grass. I never did. But I still think about her. The girl in the forest, the one who cries when the light fades. She wasn't malicious, not like the Hidebehind. She wasn't hunting, she was reaching. That's what scared me the most. There was something in her voice, something that felt human. I think that's why people answer. Not because they're careless, but because she sounds like someone who needs help. And we're wired to help. But sometimes, in certain places, helping is the last thing you should do. I've taken fewer jobs since then. I ask more questions before signing any contract. I check local history, ask old-timers what they've heard, and if there's a place the locals won't enter after a certain time of day, I don't try to be the exception. I've seen what happens when you ignore those warnings. And I've learned that not every spirit wants to hurt you, but that doesn't make them any less dangerous, especially the ones who cry. Story 3. The Glimmer Man. I'm not a superstitious man, not really. I fix engines for a living, not chase shadows. My name's R. Daniels, and I've lived just outside Taos, New Mexico for over 15 years. The property I own isn't much, just a modest house sitting on 7 acres of pinon and juniper trees, but it's quiet, secluded, and the kind of place where you can actually hear yourself think. I bought it in 2010, after the housing market crash, when prices were rock bottom. It was a foreclosure, needed a good amount of work, but I've always been handy. The views were what sold me. The Sangre de Cristo Mountains to the east, stars so bright at night they cast shadows across the porch. That kind of stillness becomes part of you after a while. For the most part, life was simple. I worked as a mechanic at Cortez Auto in the nearest town. Steady, if not stellar, pay. It kept the bills covered. That was enough. Until my mother's health took a turn. She'd been in assisted living in Albuquerque for years, but late-stage Alzheimer's meant she now needed specialized care, twice the cost. My sister helped when she could, but with 3 kids and her husband recently laid off, most of the weight fell on me. That's when I looked to the land. I had trees, a lot of them. Winters get cold here, and firewood sells well. I already had a decent chainsaw from years of clearing deadfall, so I invested in a used hydraulic log splitter and started harvesting firewood on weekends. It wasn't glamorous, but if I could cut and split just 2 cords a month, that would help cover the rising bills. I set up my cutting operation in a small clearing about a quarter mile from the house. Flat terrain, easy ATV access, and surrounded by trees already damaged by storms. It felt like a practical solution, a way to take care of what needed doing. But I didn't know then that something else lived in those trees. Something quiet, something patient, and something that didn't like being watched or worse, noticed. The first few weeks went smoothly. I'd work the weekends, early morning until just past noon to beat the heat, then again in the late afternoon. Done till dusk. The rhythm was satisfying. Pick the tree, fell it clean, bucket into rounds, split and stack. I sold my first few cords easily to a family up in Ranchos who paid cash and didn't haggle. The work was hard, sure, but honest, and for a while it felt good to have a clear purpose. Then came July 16th, my mother's birthday. I'd visited her that morning in Albuquerque, spent a couple of hours sitting with her even though she barely recognized me anymore. By the time I got back home, it was mid-afternoon, and I figured I'd try to squeeze in a few hours of cutting. The sky was heavy with clouds building to the west, but I thought I had time before the rain rolled in. I rode the ATV out to the clearing and started working. That's when I felt it. Not all at once, not like some jolt of panic. It crept in slowly, like a draft you don't notice until your hands are cold. A prickling sensation on the back of my neck. The feeling that I wasn't alone. I shut off the chainsaw, thinking maybe a deer or coyote was nearby, but I heard nothing. No rustle, no bird calls, not even the wind. just the oppressive silence that settled between the trees like fog. I scanned the clearing, the dense line of juniper and scrub oak at its edge, but saw nothing out of place. Eventually, I shook it off and got back to work. But that feeling that I was being watched clung to me like humidity. It was irrational. But it was real. For the next several days, it became a pattern. Every time I stepped into the clearing, I felt it. The prickling, the tension, the unnatural silence. Once or twice, I thought I saw something move in my peripheral vision, just a shimmer like heat rising off pavement. But when I turned, there was nothing there. I told myself it was stress, or maybe exhaustion. The added pressure of bills, of family, of responsibility. That was easier to accept than the alternative, that something was watching me. The breathing started the next weekend. I'd shut off the chainsaw to reposition a log when I heard it. Deep, slow, rhythmic breathing coming from just beyond the trees. Not the pant of a dog or the quick snort of a deer. This was steady and massive, like a bellows being drawn in and pushed out again. I walked toward the sound, pushing aside branches, trying to catch a glimpse of whatever it was. But the breathing stopped as soon as I got close. And again, no tracks, no signs, no sound, just stillness. After that, I started carrying a hunting knife strapped to my hip and keeping my phone recording audio while I worked. I reviewed the recordings at night, hoping to catch something, anything, but they were always the same. Chainsaw noise, rustling brush, the occasional crow. Nothing else. The storm hit a few days later, an afternoon monsoon that dumped nearly an inch of rain in under an hour. That night, I sat on my porch watching lightning claw the sky above the mountains, listening to thunder rumble through the valley. Normally, I loved storms, but that night, I found myself scanning the tree line, unable to shake the feeling that I wasn't the only one watching. The next morning, I returned to the clearing. The ground was damp, soft enough to reveal any tracks. I found the usual deer prints, a set of coyote tracks, but nothing unusual. Still, as soon as I started cutting again, the feeling returned, stronger than before. The air felt charged. Every pause in the chainsaw's roar brought with it that same rhythmic breathing, always circling me, always just out of reach. On the fifth day, I heard footsteps. They didn't follow directly behind me, but flanked me, 20 yards out, moving, parallel through the brush. When I stopped walking, so did they. When I sped up, they matched my pace. They were heavy, too heavy for a man and too precise for an animal. Branches snapped underfoot, gravel crunched. I gripped my saw tighter, heart pounding in my throat. Back at the house, I ate lunch without tasting it and brought binoculars out with me for the afternoon session. I searched the tree line. Nothing. But then, things escalated. I saw branches sway without wind. I heard breathing in stereo, moving, circling, close enough to feel. Twice I caught flickers in the trees, vertical shapes where the light shimmered. Oddly like reality itself had warped for a second, but when I blinked or turned, it was gone. One afternoon I even called out, "You want something?" I shouted. The trees gave no reply, only silence. That night I had the distinct feeling, call it a certainty, that whatever it was had followed me home. I started sleeping with my porch light on, checked the locks twice, avoided the clearing, but I couldn't stay away for long. I needed the money, and deep down, I was starting to believe that not facing it, whatever it was, might be worse. It was the afternoon of July 21st, when everything finally unraveled. The day was still, oppressively so. No wind, no bird calls, not even the buzzing of flies. The kind of stillness that screams in your ears. I'd been working for hours, trying to finish splitting a large pile of rounds before dusk. Sweat soaked through my shirt, and my gloves were slick from the heat. I'd pushed the feeling of being watched into the background, had to, just to function. But it never really left. Then as I leaned over to refuel the chainsaw, it returned, not as a sensation this time, but as a sound. Breathing, deep and slow, not 20 feet away. I froze. The forest was completely quiet, but the breathing was unmistakable, measured, and massive, like it was coming from a creature whose lungs could fill a room. I turned slowly toward the stand of juniper trees where it was coming from. That's when I saw it, or rather, saw where it shouldn't have been. It wasn't a body or a shape exactly. It was distortion, like heat waves rising off asphalt, but upright, vertical and human-sized. The air itself shimmered, bending the trees behind it in a way that made my eyes ache. It didn't move like anything alive. It pulsed slightly, like the space around it was vibrating. I blinked and it shifted, just a little, enough to confirm. It was watching me. I dropped the gas can. It hit the ground and spilled across my boots. I didn't care. My hands were shaking so hard I could barely pick up the chainsaw. I fumbled the cap, sloshed fuel, forced it back on with trembling fingers. The shimmer hadn't moved, but the air around it felt denser, tighter. I finally got the chainsaw started, the roar of the engine exploding through the silent clearing, like a flare gun. I turned to grab the rest of my gear, and that's when I heard it. Footsteps. Heavy, deliberate, crushing gravel and snapping twigs directly behind me. I didn't look. I couldn't. I just ran. Sprinting across the clearing, every instinct in me screaming that if I stopped, if I turned around, I wouldn't make it back. The footsteps grew louder, faster, right on my heels. I reached the ATV, yanked the keys from my chest pocket, but they slipped through my fingers. I bent to grab them, and something pushed me, hard. I landed face first in the dirt, air knocked from my lungs. I rolled over, arms raised to defend myself, but there was nothing there. Only the fading sound of footsteps retreating back into the trees, accompanied by fast, excited breathing, like whatever it was had enjoyed the chase. I didn't wait. I jammed the key into the ignition, started the ATV, and tore down the trail, without looking back. But even over the engine's roar, I swore I could still hear it breathing, just out of sight. I never went back to that clearing. The next day, I sold the hydraulic log splitter to a guy in Espanola for half of what I paid. Took out a small loan to cover the gap in my mother's care. It wasn't ideal, but it felt like the safer choice. I told myself I'd return someday, to collect the gear I left behind, the fuel cans, the stacked rounds, even my favorite axe. But weeks passed, then months. Eventually I stopped making excuses and accepted the truth. Whatever was out there didn't want me coming back. And I was more than happy to respect that boundary. Sometimes on still days when the wind dies and the air hangs heavy, I sit on the back porch and stare toward the trees. The clearing is just out of sight, hidden behind a low ridge and a wall of junipers. But even without seeing it, I feel it, that pressure, that silence. Once or twice I've thought I heard it again, the breathing, faint, slow, like something remembering me, or worse, waiting. I've told a few close friends what happened. Most of them think I was overworked, sleep-deprived, maybe dealing with some kind of heat stroke. But I know what I saw. I know what I felt. And the thing that still unsettles me most isn't the shimmer or the push or the chase. It's how deliberate it all was. Like it knew me, like it studied me, like it was toying with me the whole time. I've lived in this place for over a decade, but after that summer, it doesn't feel entirely like mine anymore. Story 4, Bigfoot. This happened in October of 2023, deep in the Olympic Peninsula in Washington state, a place known for its thick forests, constant drizzle, and stories whispered by locals that usually end with, "And that's why we don't." Go there after dark. My name's Bryson, and I work as a land surveyor specializing in pre-logging site assessments. I've done this job for over a decade now, and honestly, I prefer working solo. Less chatter, more focus. Most of the time it's straightforward work. Marking boundaries, assessing tree density, checking soil conditions. But every so often, a site comes along that just feels different. The timber company had recently acquired rights to around 200 acres of untouched forest and needed a full assessment before bringing in the logging crews. On paper, it was a 2 or 3 day job depending on weather. I packed light, just the essentials, gear, GPS, flagging tape, bear spray, and drove in early that Monday morning. The trail into the site was rough but manageable, and I remember thinking how peaceful it all seemed. Mist hung low between the trees, catching the morning light like ribbons of silk. Not a sound except the occasional call of a raven or the distant drip of water from pine needles. By noon, I'd already marked most of the perimeter and moved deeper into the interior to check the terrain. That's when I noticed the quiet. Not the kind of quiet you get in remote places, but the kind that wraps around you like a blanket, thick, heavy, unnatural. No birds, no rustling, no breeze, just silence. I paused, stood still for a few seconds, thinking maybe my ears were playing tricks. But the silence stayed long enough to make my skin crawl. Still, I had a job to do. I pushed forward, trying not to think about how loud my own footsteps suddenly sounded on the damp forest floor. If I'd listened to my instincts then, maybe I would have turned around. But I didn't. And what followed was the closest I've ever come to believing that some legends are rooted in more than just stories. They're warnings. I kept working despite the silence. Logging jobs are tough on schedules, and I didn't want to get a reputation for being skittish, so I pressed on, marking trees, noting slope angles, and flagging potential hazards. But the feeling that something was wrong never left me. Every movement I made felt amplified in the stillness, the crack of a twig underfoot, the metallic snap of my measuring tape. Even the rustle of my jacket seemed too loud, like the forest was holding its breath, waiting. Around 1:30, a soft drizzle began to fall, just enough to patter against the leaves and mask small sounds. I welcomed it at first, hoping it would shake some of that tension from the trees, bring back the normal sounds of wildlife. It didn't. In fact, it felt like the rain made everything quieter, like it had muffled the world even more. I was measuring the diameter of a massive Douglas fir when I heard it, a low rustling deeper in the woods. It wasn't the wind. The movement was deliberate, steady, too heavy for a deer. I froze, bear spray in hand, and waited. Then I saw the trees move, 40, maybe 50 yards out. I didn't see the thing itself, not at first. Just the swaying of branches, large ones, and the slight bowing of younger saplings, like something massive was pushing through. I crouched slightly, trying to make out a shape, but the vegetation was too dense. Still, whatever it was had to be enormous. Tall, broad, strong enough to shift trees without slowing down. It didn't make the crashing noise of a bear, but rather a steady series of impacts, like controlled, powerful steps. The hairs on the back of my neck rose, then it stopped. Complete stillness returned. Even the rain seemed to pause. I scanned the area, heart hammering in my chest. That's when the breaking began. Sharp cracks, 1, 2, 3 in quick succession. Not twigs. These were thick branches, snapped like toothpicks. Each one echoed through the trees. The fourth snap was followed by the sound of an entire sapling being shaken, its top thrashing wildly against the canopy. I could feel it through the ground, subtle vibrations through the soles of my boots. That was no bear. Instinct told me to back away, and for once, I listened. I started moving slowly, trying not to make sudden noises, keeping my eyes on the dense brush where the movement had come from. That's when I heard the footsteps again. Heavy, deliberate, and terrifyingly close. Whatever it was following me, but staying just out of view. Every few steps, it would snap another branch or shake another tree like it wanted me. To know it was there, not hunting, not attacking, just letting me feel its presence. I picked up my pace, still walking, not running, but faster now. I pulled out my GPS unit to check the route back toward the access road, my fingers slick from rain and nerves. The thing kept pace with me through the woods, about 30 yards to my right. Then it made a sound, low, guttural, like a grunt, but so deep it felt like it vibrated in my chest. That sound no human could make. That's when the first log came flying. It wasn't a branch, it was more like a small tree trunk, maybe 6 inches thick and 10 feet long. It came crashing through the canopy and slammed into the forest floor about 10 feet in front of me, spraying dirt and pine needles in all directions. I stopped dead in my tracks. My brain hadn't caught up yet. A moment passed, then another log, smaller this time, flew past, narrowly missing my left shoulder. That was it. I ran. The moment I broke into a sprint, everything behind me came alive. The footsteps, heavy, crashing, furious, were no longer keeping pace. They were closing the distance. I could hear the trees behind me groaning, branches snapping like dry bones, under enormous weight. Every time I turned my head just a fraction, I caught swaying movement, entire saplings bowing and recoiling like something had just barreled through them. Whatever was chasing me wasn't just large, it was massive. And it wasn't just trying to scare me anymore, it wanted me gone. The ground was slick from rain, and I skidded more than once, barely keeping my feet beneath me. I remember the mud, caking the soles of my boots, the sharp sting of brambles across my arms as I crashed through undergrowth. I lost my GPS somewhere along the way, didn't even feel it fall out of my pocket. All I could focus on was forward, survive, get out. My lungs burned, my legs screamed. But that thing, whatever it was, never let up. I could hear its breath, now rhythmic and violent, panting like some primal machine, getting louder and closer by the second. That's when it threw something again. Not a branch this time. A rock. A boulder, really. It crashed into the ground no more than 5 feet to my right, spraying mud and water like a landmine. The impact sent me stumbling sideways into a shallow ravine, where I lost my footing and tumbled hard onto my side. For a moment I lay still, stunned, wind knocked clean out of me. I heard it approaching, closer than ever. A roar, not human, not animal, ripped through the trees behind me. It shook something inside my ribs. I scrambled up, half running, half crawling up the embankment, soaked and shaking, and then it stopped. Just like that. The footsteps halted. The breathing ceased. No growl, no warning. I reached the clearing at the forest's edge, flung myself into the open without looking back. My truck was there. Thank God it was still there. I threw the door open, turned the key with trembling hands, and when the engine roared to life, it felt like surfacing from underwater. In the rearview mirror I saw the trees sway again, one last ripple through the trunks, but I saw nothing emerge, whatever it was. It had let me go, or maybe it didn't have to follow. Maybe it already knew I wouldn't dare come back. I didn't include any of what happened in my official report. How could I? You can't put giant territorial creature through a log at me in a document meant for executives and expect to keep your job. Instead, I cited unstable ground conditions, high-density hazards, and potential large predator activity. I recommended that all future surveys be conducted by teams of at least 3 and strongly advised against any immediate operations. The company grumbled but backed off. My reputation for thorough, no-nonsense work helped. And frankly, I think some of them read between the lines. A few weeks later, I ran into an elderly native man in a grocery store parking lot. We got to talking about the area. When I mentioned I'd been working deep in the forest, his eyes narrowed. Some trees, he said quietly, aren't meant to be touched. Some places have guardians. He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. I've never gone back to that site. I've worked plenty of other forests since, but none have ever felt quite like that one. And I've learned to trust that stillness now, the way the forest goes quiet just before something happens. It's not absence, it's a warning. And I listen. Story 5. Kenny the Saboteur. A few months after my heart surgery, I was finally cleared to return to work, something I wasn't entirely sure would ever happen again. Open heart surgery sounds dramatic because it is. The recovery was long, painful, and filled with more anxiety than I cared to admit. But once I got the all clear, I was eager to get back out in the field. I work as an equipment technician for a logging company, mostly inspecting and repairing chainsaws, skidders, harvesters, you name it. I was one of 2 techs sent up north to a site in rural Maine that had been having issues, strange ones. The crew up there had reported a bizarre string of equipment malfunctions, chainsaws locking up for no reason, hydraulic failures in brand new machines, and worst of all, a harvester whose brakes gave out while carrying a full load down a slope. The operator survived only because he slammed into a dirt berm instead of going over a 50-foot drop. The incident had rattled everyone, and management wanted answers. I was sent up with Victor, another tech with a background in industrial accident investigation. He specialized in smaller machinery and safety systems, while I handled the heavy stuff. Between the 2 of us, we were expected to figure out what was going on and whether it was mechanical failure, user error, or something worse. The site was isolated, accessed only by a narrow logging trail deep in the woods, the kind of place where you could work for weeks and never see another soul who wasn't part of the crew. When we arrived, the foreman handed us stacks of maintenance logs and incident reports, then directed us to a converted trailer that would serve as both our workshop and sleeping quarters. Everything looked standard at first. Machines were modern, documentation thorough, crew experienced. But the moment we began inspecting the damaged equipment, the story changed. What we found didn't look like accidents. The cuts were too precise. The failures too deliberate. Someone knew exactly what to sabotage, and when, and whoever it was, they weren't done. Victor and I got to work immediately. We started with the chainsaws, and that's when things began to feel off. Several of them had jammed mid-operation, which isn't unusual by itself. What was unusual was that the chain assemblies had been tampered with in subtle but precise ways. Small retaining bolts, loosened just enough to cause stress fractures, tensioning mechanisms adjusted to fail after several hours of use. To the untrained eye, it would look like wear and tear, but to us it looked calculated, intentional. We moved on to the skidders next. One had lost hydraulic pressure during a routine pull. I opened the casing, expecting to find a worn seal or cracked line. Instead, I found a surgical slice, so clean it could have been made with a scalpel, right at a junction point that would only see high pressure under full load. That cut wouldn't cause failure immediately. It would wait, lurk, until the machine was under maximum strain, then burst. It would look like a fluke, but it wasn't. The harvester was the worst. The brake system hadn't simply failed, it had been bypassed. A small pin removed from the emergency backup system, a pin that would never come loose on its own, and that no one without technical knowledge would even think to touch. We looked at each other, both coming to the same conclusion. This was sabotage. Someone with intimate knowledge of the equipment was causing these failures, slowly, quietly, and in a way that looked natural to outsiders. When we told the foreman, he went pale, swore up and down that no one on his current crew would do something so reckless. "They're good men," he said, voice tight. "Too much experience. They know what these machines can do if they go wrong." But I noticed some of the older guys exchanging looks, silent glances that spoke louder than words. One of them, a grizzled chainsaw operator named Gus, avoided our eyes completely. Something was being left unsaid. Over the next few days we kept working, documenting every flaw, every detail. The deeper we dug, the clearer it became. Someone was staging these accidents to look like mechanical failure. The sabotage wasn't random. It was targeted, strategic. It almost felt personal. Eventually, Gus pulled us aside during a lunch break. He looked like he hadn't slept in days. Voice low, he told us about a former crew member, Kenny Boone. Kenny had been the lead mechanic at this site up until 4 months ago. Everyone agreed he was brilliant with machines, one of those guys who could fix anything blindfolded. But something had changed in him. He grew paranoid, withdrawn, started accusing others of stealing tools or messing with his work. Then came the incident. Kenny had been caught siphoning fuel from a storage tank, and when confronted by a supervisor, he snapped, took a tire iron to the man's knee, nearly shattered it. They fired him on the spot, called in security, but instead of going quietly, Kenny grabbed a hatchet from his truck, screamed something about making them pay, and vanished into the woods. He didn't take the road. He disappeared between the trees, wearing a heavy jacket and a pack stuffed with supplies. They searched for days. Never found him. After that, the sabotage began. The more Gus talked, the worse it sounded. They'd written Kenny off as dead, assumed he'd either gotten lost or given up and moved on. But Gus wasn't so sure. He knows these woods better than anyone, he said. Knows every trail, every blind spot. If he's out there, he's watching us. That night, Victor and I lay awake in the trailer, listening to every creak and groan outside. Around 2 in the morning, Victor shook me awake. He swore he'd heard someone breathing outside, slow, deliberate, just on the other side of the metal wall. We crept out with flashlights, but there were no footprints, no signs anyone had been there. Just the cold night air and a silence so dense it felt like it pressed against your skin. The next morning, things escalated. We had just finished inspecting a damaged skidder and stepped away to grab a tool set from the trailer. When we returned, barely 10 minutes later, there were fresh footprints in the mud circling the machine. Deep prints, mismatched soles, like someone was wearing 2 different boots. They hadn't been there when we left. Someone had been watching us, waiting for us to leave, then walked right up to our workspace. Later that same day, every tool we brought was gone. Vanished from the trailer. No signs of forced entry, nothing broken, everything, every wrench, socket, gauge, just gone. All except for one thing. A hatchet. It had been buried deep into a pine tree near the edge of camp. The blade was old and rusted, the handle wrapped in blackened tape soaked through with sweat and grime. Gus took one look at it and turned white. "That's Kenny's," he whispered. "Same one he carried off into the woods." We filed a report with the company and notified local law enforcement. But that night, just after midnight, we all heard it. A chainsaw running deep in the forest, full throttle, not cutting, just screaming. It echoed through the trees like a war cry. I'll never forget that sound, and I knew then we weren't dealing with ghost stories or legends. We were dealing with a man who had turned the forest into his own hunting ground, and he was still out there. We didn't sleep after that night, not really. Every sound outside the trailer became a threat. Every creak in the trees a possible approach. The chainsaw had run for nearly an hour, fading in and out like it was moving through the woods. It never cut anything, just idled, then roared, then went silent again. We were too far out for it to be another logging crew. No one was supposed to be working that late, and none of the men on site would have been foolish enough to run a saw that long without a reason. It was a message. Kenny was out there, and he wanted us to know he was close. The next morning, several crew members refused to work. Victor and I packed our remaining tools, what little we had left, and prepared to leave. We were done. It wasn't about finding evidence anymore. It was about getting out safely. But as we approached the tree line to check the last machine, we saw something that made our blood run cold. The equipment, an idle harvester, was surrounded by a circle of small items. Our missing tools, a wrench here, a screwdriver there. A pressure gauge balanced delicately on a stump. It was laid out like an altar. In the center, jammed into the ground, was the hatchet, cleaned now, sharpened, polished to a dull gleam. Its blade caught the early morning light just enough to shine, and attached to its handle, wrapped tightly in a strip of stained red cloth, was a handwritten note. 4 words. You should have stayed gone. We didn't touch it. Didn't say a word. We backed away one step at a time and returned to the trailer. Within an hour, Victor and I were gone. We didn't even wait for the company's green light. The foreman shut the operation down 2 days later, after a skidder was found overturned, and 2 more chainsaws disappeared. Officially, the site was labeled logistically compromised, but the crew knew better. Everyone did. The police never found Kenny Boone, but that wasn't the point. He didn't need to be found. Not anymore. He was the forest now, and anyone who came too close, he'd remind them. Victor and I never went back. The company tried to relocate us to another site 2 weeks later, but we both turned it down. I took a long leave after that, partly for my health, partly because I couldn't stop thinking about that note. You should have stayed gone. I don't know if it was meant for us specifically or for the entire operation, but it hit like a warning that came too late. The site was eventually written off as a loss. The only thing they left behind, as far as I know, was Kenny's hatchet. No one wanted to touch it. No one wanted to be the one who brought it back. To this day, whenever I hear a chainsaw fire up in the woods, I tense. My mind flashes back to that night, Victor waking me up, the sound of heavy footsteps circling the trailer, and that blade gleaming in the morning sun like it had never been forgotten. We spend so much time worrying about monsters in the woods, about spirits and shadows. But sometimes the most dangerous thing out there isn't supernatural. It's a man who knows your tools better than you do, a man who's been waiting, alone, long enough to become the legend himself. Thank you for venturing into the darkness with us. If these stories sent chills down your spine, don't keep the fear to yourself. Leave a comment, smash that like button, and share this video with someone who dares to listen in the dark. We release terrifying true stories every week, so be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss what's lurking in the shadows. This is High Scare Stories, where nightmares don't end when the video does. Until next time, stay safe and stay scared.